The morning of my anniversary, I stood in the kitchen at 6:30, doing what I'd done every year for the past 7 years. I made 2 cups of tea. Old habit, I suppose. 41 years of marriage in your hands, just remember. I set one on the counter, where Maureen used to sit, next to the window that looks out over the back garden. The roses she planted in 2003 were just starting to come through again. She would have liked that. The 23rd of April. 7 years since I lost her. I'd been planning this dinner for weeks. Nothing elaborate, just the roast she used to make on Sundays, the one my daughter-in-law had never learned to cook right, the one my son had grown up on. Lamb shoulder. Slow cooked, with roasted vegetables, and the gravy that takes most of the afternoon to get right. I'd driven to the butcher in Epping on the Tuesday. Bought the good cut. Spent Thursday evening making a pavlova because the grandkids loved it, and Maureen always said no family meal was complete without something sweet at the end. I'd sent the message to my son, Lachlan, 3 weeks before, April 23rd. Mum's anniversary. Come for dinner. Bring the kids. He'd replied with a thumbs up. That should have told me something right there. I set the table for 6. Lachlan, his wife Kristen, and their 3 children Zoe, who was 12, and the twins Finn and Harper, who'd just turned 8, plus me. 6 plates, 6 sets of cutlery. The good glasses Maureen kept for occasions. The ones we'd bought together at a market in the Hunter Valley the year before she was diagnosed. The lamb went in at noon. By 2 o'clock, the whole house smelled like Sunday afternoons from 30 years ago, and I found myself standing in the hallway looking at the photos on the wall, Maureen holding newborn Lachlan in the hospital, the 2 of us at our 25th anniversary dinner in Brisbane. A family Christmas from maybe 2008, where everyone looked a little sunburned, and Zoe wasn't even born yet. At 3, I sent Lachlan a message. Dinner will be ready around 6, drive safe. No reply. At 4:30 I tried calling. It rang out. I left a message. Nothing strange, yet he was probably in the car, or the kids were being noisy. I turned the vegetables. Tasted the gravy. Adjusted the salt. At 5:15, my phone buzzed. Sorry, Dad. Can't make it tonight. Something came up with Kristen's family. We'll explain later. Sorry. I read it 3 times. I stood in the kitchen with the phone in my hand, and the lamb resting on the bench, and the pavlova in the fridge, and Maureen's good glasses on the table, and I read that message 3 times. Something came up with Kristen's family. I typed back. It's your mum's anniversary, mate. 3 dots appeared. Then disappeared. Then appeared again. I know. I'm sorry. We'll come by on the weekend. I put the phone down on the counter next to the cup of tea I'd made for Maureen that morning, which had long gone cold. I sat down. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the light to change through the kitchen window. Long enough for the lamb to go from resting to just warm to stone cold. I wasn't crying. I want to be clear about that, because I know how this sounds, and I don't want anyone thinking I sat there feeling sorry for myself. I was thinking, really thinking, maybe for the first time in years, about how I'd ended up in a kitchen alone on the most significant day of my year, having cooked a full Sunday roast for people who hadn't even had the decency to call. That night I ate alone. A single plate, a single glass of the red I'd bought for the occasion. I wrapped the rest in foil and put it in the fridge. I washed up. I went to bed. I didn't sleep much. What I need to tell you, what I should probably have understood a long time before I actually did, is that this wasn't a one-off. It wasn't an unusual bad day or a miscommunication or the kind of thing that happens in every family sometimes. It was a pattern. And I'd been living inside it so long I'd stopped being able to see it clearly. Lachlan is my only child. His mother and I had wanted more, but it didn't happen. So all of our energy, all of our hope and attention and financial support went into him. He was a bright kid, genuinely clever, good with people, the kind of boy who could charm anyone in a room. He did well in school without trying particularly hard, which in hindsight was probably not the best sign. He studied business at UTS and graduated in 2008, right into the GFC, which was rough timing for everyone. Maureen and I helped out. Of course we did. That's what you do. We lent him $15,000 when he was 26 so he and Kristen could get their deposit together. I say lent, I have the paperwork. I wrote it up properly. But I knew even then that neither of us expected to see it back. It didn't matter. They were young. Sydney was expensive, and we wanted them to have a good start. Then Lachlan started a business, importing outdoor furniture, distribution to retail chains across New South Wales and Queensland. He had a good head for the commercial side, but he was undercapitalized from the beginning. And within 18 months, he was in trouble. I put in $42,000 to cover his operating costs and keep the supplier relationships alive. That time I didn't even bother with paperwork. He was my son. What was I going to do? Sue him. Over the next 4 years, between that business and the next one, he tried a project management consultancy that never really got off the ground. I transferred various amounts that I stopped adding up at some point because the number was making me uncomfortable. When Maureen got sick in 2014, I was already stretched. Not ruined. Not by any means. I'd had a good career in civil engineering, worked for a large firm for 32 years, and we had the house in Cherrybrook outright, plus some solid super, but stretched. Stretched in a way I didn't tell Maureen about because she had enough on her mind. She died in April 2017. I was 63 years old, and for the first time in my adult life, I was genuinely alone. Lachlan was wonderful in those first weeks. He came round every few days. Kristen brought meals. The grandkids were a reason to get out of bed. I won't pretend otherwise. That period was real, and I'm grateful for it. But grief doesn't stay acute forever. And after about 6 months, things slowly returned to what I would come to understand was normal. Lachlan called less. Visits became monthly, then less than that. When they did come, it was busy, rushed. The kids needed to be somewhere else by a certain time, and he started asking for things again. The consultancy had wound up. He had an idea for a new venture, commercial property management software, he said. There was a real gap in the market. He needed capital to bring on a developer. 30,000, he thought. Maybe 35. I gave him 30. I told myself it was an investment. I told myself he had a good idea and just needed a proper runway this time. I told myself that's what fathers do. Over the following 3 years, I gave him another 46,000 in various tranches. I helped pay off a tax debt. I paid for a family holiday to Bali. He called it a working trip. Said he was meeting with a software vendor, but from the photos on Instagram, it looked like a week at a resort, which it was. I covered 2 terms of private school fees for Zoe. When he said they were in a tight month, I transferred money for what he told me was a car repair that I later found out was a car upgrade. And here's the thing I'm most ashamed of, not because I did it, but because of how long it took me to notice. I'd stopped thinking of any of this as lending. It had just become part of my budget, a line item. Lachlan monthly, some months nothing, some months several thousand, and I'd adjusted my own life accordingly. I'd stopped traveling. I'd put off replacing the hot water system for 2 years until it actually failed. I was eating simply, buying on special, watching my own spending in ways that a man with my super and my paid-off house really should not have needed to. I was 70 years old and I was scrimping so my 42-year-old son could live comfortably. I want to tell you about what changed, because I've told you enough about what didn't. About 2 months after the anniversary dinner that never happened, I was going through some old paperwork The kind of tedious administrative exercise you do when you're retired and alone, sorting through the filing cabinet, trying to get things in order. I found all of it. Every transfer, every receipt, every piece of paper I'd kept because something in me insisted I should. I sat down at the dining table with a notepad and I added it up properly. All of it. From the first deposit loan to the most recent transfer I'd made 8 weeks prior, when Lachlan said the software business needed to cover a contractor invoice or they'd lose a key client. The total, including interest at the rate I would have received had I left the money in term deposits, was just over $320,000. I sat very still for a long time. $320,000. Over 17 years. To one person. My son. I thought about Maureen, who never knew the full extent of it. I thought about the trip to Italy we'd planned for our 40th anniversary. The one we kept pushing back because the timing wasn't right. She never made it to 41. We never went to Italy. I thought about the hot water system. I thought about the holidays I hadn't taken. I thought about the financial advisor I'd seen in 2019 who'd asked about my liquidity and I'd given numbers that weren't quite honest. Then I called my oldest friend. His name is Gordon. We went to school together in Wollongong, and he's been a constant for 55 years. One of those rare people who can tell me the truth without softening it into uselessness. He listened. He didn't say anything until I'd finished, which took a while. Then he said, "You already know what you need to do." He was right. I did. The thing that finally pushed me from knowing to doing happened on a Thursday evening in late June. I'd had a strange few weeks. After adding everything up, I'd become more observant, I suppose, paying attention to things I'd trained myself not to notice. The way Lachlan's messages to me were almost entirely transactional, responding to logistics, forwarding things he needed me to sign, the occasional photo of the grandkids that felt more like a receipt than a gift. The way Kristen had never once, in 17 years, rung me just to talk. The way I couldn't remember the last time either of them had asked how I was and waited for an actual answer. That Thursday, Lachlan called. He needed to talk through something, he said. Could we do dinner? We met at a pub in Parramatta, halfway between his place and mine. He was already there when I arrived, sitting with a schooner, looking at his phone. He'd been approached by a development company, he told me. A residential project out near Penrith. The numbers looked good, but the entry threshold was significant. He was thinking about it seriously. He wanted to know if I'd be interested in coming in as a co-investor. I asked him how much. He said initially around $80,000. Possibly more in later tranches depending on how the project phased. I looked at my son across the table. 42 years old, healthy and well-dressed, and he was sitting across from his 70-year-old father, asking for $80,000 with the same relaxed ease that another man might ask to borrow a ladder. I asked him a question I'd never asked before, not in all those years. What's happened to all the money I've already given you? He looked uncomfortable. He said it was different each time, different circumstances. I said, Lachlan, I've given you $320,000. He went quiet. I said, I've added it up. Every transfer since 2006. $320,000. And that's conservative because I stopped keeping records for a few years in the middle. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and I want to be precise here, because it matters, he said, Dad, that money helped build our life. It wasn't wasted. Your life, I said. It built your life. He didn't have an answer for that. I said I needed to think and I paid for the drinks and I drove home. That night I went through everything again. And then I opened my laptop and I looked up the firm that had handled my estate planning when Maureen passed. I sent them an email, and then, before I closed the laptop, I opened Facebook. I check it maybe once a fortnight. I'm not a social media person, and there, at the top of the feed, was a post from Kristen, a photo. A resort. Palm trees. Blue water. What looked like the Whitsundays. Kristen, in a sundress with a cocktail. Lachlan, grinning in board shorts. All five of them. Looking sun-kissed and relaxed and happy. The caption said, "Finally. Just us. So needed this." Posted at 4:30 that afternoon. While I was sitting in a pub in Parramatta being asked for $80,000, I sat with that for a long time. I'm not going to tell you I didn't feel it. I did. Something shifted that night. Some last remaining thread of self-deception that I'd been holding on to for a very long time. I'd known, intellectually, what the dynamic was. But there's a difference between knowing something in your head and feeling it land in your chest. They were on a holiday I'd effectively funded through 17 years of transfers. And they were posting sunsets while he asked me for more. So needed this. I thought, yes, so do I. The solicitor's name is Renwick. I've used him for years, sharp as a tack. Doesn't waste words. We met the following Tuesday. I told him what I wanted. I wanted to review the structure of everything. The estate, the beneficiary arrangements, the way my assets were currently positioned. I wanted to understand my options. He walked me through it clearly. The house in Cherrybrook was mine outright. My superannuation was in good shape, not extravagant, but solid, enough to see me through comfortably if I was sensible. I had some shares I'd held for a long time that had done well. I told him about the $320,000. He noted it without visible reaction, which I appreciated. We talked about the grandkids. This was the part I'd been turning over in my mind since that night at the pub. Zoe and the twins had nothing to do with any of this. They were children. Whatever their parents were or weren't, Zoe and Finn and Harper were my grandchildren, and I loved them, and I had no intention of making them pay for the choices of their parents. Renwick explained the mechanism clearly. A properly structured testamentary trust could ensure that whatever I left was held and managed for the benefit of the children directly, on terms that meant their parents couldn't access or redirect it. The grandkids would have what they needed for education, for starting their adult lives, and their parents would have no say in how it was managed. That gave me considerable peace. Then I told Renwick I would no longer be making any further financial transfers to Lachlan. Not investments, not loans, not anything. I asked him to draft a letter that I could send clear, civil, unemotional, that explained my position. He drafted it that afternoon. I read it, changed one sentence, and told him to send it. Lachlan called the next morning at 7:45. I let it ring. He called again at 8. Then he sent a text. "Dad, we need to talk about this letter." I replied, "I know. I'm available Tuesday afternoon if you want to come by." He arrived at 2 on Tuesday. Without Kristen, which surprised me a little. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table I'd set for 6 on the 23rd of April, with Maureen's good glasses, and he looked genuinely shaken, which I'll acknowledge, because I'm not going to pretend this was easy or that I felt nothing. He said he didn't understand. He said things had been tight lately, but that was temporary. He said the development opportunity was genuine, and I'd be throwing away a real return. I said, "I'm not here to talk about the investment. I'm here because I want to have an honest conversation with you for the first time in a long time." And we did. It wasn't comfortable. He got defensive, then subdued. He said he hadn't realized how much it had added up to, which I don't fully believe, but I'm willing to accept as partially true. It's possible to lose track of accumulated taking, just as it's possible to lose track of accumulated giving. He said he felt like I was punishing him. I said, "I'm not punishing you, mate. I'm stopping. There's a difference." He left after an hour. We didn't hug. He said he'd call me during the week, and he didn't, which was fine. What happened over the next few months I'll describe briefly. Because this isn't a story about his reaction, it's about what I did. I took Gordon and his wife up to the Hunter Valley for a long weekend. We stayed at a place Maureen and I had always talked about going back to, and we ate well and talked for hours, and I slept 10 hours a night and felt, honestly, like someone had lifted something off my back that I'd forgotten I was carrying. I booked a trip to Italy, on my own, for 3 weeks in September. Rome, Florence, the Amalfi Coast. I went. I walked until my feet ached. I sat in restaurants alone and ate long meals and drank good wine and watched the light change over old cities and thought about Maureen and cried a bit and felt, underneath the grief, something that I can only describe as aliveness. Like a part of me had come back from somewhere. I had the hot water system replaced. I had the front fence painted. Small things, but they mattered. Lachlan made contact about 6 weeks after our kitchen conversation. He wanted to talk not about money, he said, just to talk. We went for a walk near the park where I used to take him as a kid. It was stilted and careful, and neither of us quite said what we meant, but it was something. I'm not going to tell you we've resolved everything, because we haven't. What I'll say is that for the first time in a very long time, I know where the line is, and I'm holding it. Zoe came to see me on her own last month. On the bus, which she is apparently now allowed to do, since she turned 13. She brought me a card she'd made and asked if she could help me in the garden. We planted seedlings in the afternoon, and she told me about a book she was reading, and I made her toasted sandwiches, and we watched half of an old film she'd never seen before, and it was the best afternoon I'd had in years. She asked me, unprompted, whether I was okay, whether I was lonely. I told her I was managing. She said, "I'm glad you're still here, Grandpa." I told her I wasn't planning on going anywhere. I've thought a lot about what I would say to someone who is where I was 3 years ago. Not the rock bottom of it, the anniversary dinner, the Facebook post, the pub conversation, but the slow middle of it. The years where you're giving and telling yourself it's love, and it is love, partly, but it's also something else. It's avoidance. It's the refusal to have a hard conversation. Because the hard conversation might cost you something, and what it might cost you is the illusion that everything is fine. Here is what I know now that I wish I'd known at 50. Money given without expectation of return is not love. It might accompany love, but it isn't love on its own. And when you give so much, for so long, without honest conversation about what you're giving, and why, and what it means, you create a situation where the other person stops seeing the giving and starts seeing the not giving as a withdrawal of something they're owed. The cruelest thing about enabling, and I use that word deliberately, because that is what it was, is that it doesn't feel like failure. It feels like devotion. It feels like sacrifice. It feels like being a good parent. And in the short term, it often is those things, or contains them. But over years and decades, it hollows something out. It hollows out the other person's sense of their own capability, and it hollows out your sense of your own value, until one day you find yourself standing in a kitchen with a cold cup of tea and a lamb roast for 6, and nobody coming. I was 70 years old before I understood that I was allowed to say no. That's not a comfortable thing to admit. But I'm admitting it because I think there are people listening to this who are where I was, who are somewhere in the middle of it, who are telling themselves, it's fine, it's love, this is what family does. And I want to say clearly, it is possible to love your children and to hold a limit at the same time. Those two things are not in conflict. In fact, I would argue now that you cannot truly do one without the other. The money I gave Lachlan over 17 years did not make him more capable or more confident or more connected to me. It did the opposite. The conversation I had with him in that kitchen, the one that was years overdue, did more for whatever relationship we still have than any transfer I ever made. The grandkids are protected. That matters to me enormously. Whatever happens between Lachlan and me, Zoe and Finn and Harper will have what they need. Maureen would have wanted that. I know she would. Italy was everything, And last Thursday I sat in the garden after dinner, as the sun went down over Maureen's roses, with a glass of something cold, listening to the neighbor's kid kicking a ball against the fence, and I thought, this is mine. This life, this evening, this quiet, it belongs to me. It took me far too long to get here. But I got here. That counts for something. I've been thinking about cause and effect a lot lately. Not in any grand philosophical sense. Just the plain, ordinary version of it that plays out in real lives, in real kitchens, over real decades. When I look back at 17 years of transfers and top-ups and quiet sacrifices, I don't see a mystery. I see a chain of choices, mine included, that led to a predictable place. Every time I said yes when I should have said nothing, every time I absorbed a cost that wasn't mine to carry, I was teaching Lachlan something. I was teaching him that I would always be there with the safety net, that the net had no edges, that it never needed to be earned or acknowledged or even noticed. I did that, not out of weakness exactly, but out of a kind of emotional avoidance dressed up as love. That's the part I had to sit with, the uncomfortable part, because here's what I know now. You cannot build genuine respect on a foundation of unconditional financial rescue. You just can't. What you build instead is dependency on one side and quiet resentment on the other. And eventually the whole thing collapses under its own weight. It collapsed for us in a pub in Parramatta, over a schooner, with my son asking for $80,000 with the same ease he might ask to borrow a folding chair. The cause was years long. The effect was that evening, and the Facebook post, and the cold lamb on the bench on the 23rd of April. What I want to say, and I mean this as plainly as I can, is that the decision I made after all of that wasn't punishment. It wasn't anger, though there was some of that too. I won't pretend otherwise. It was clarity, finally having the honesty to look at the situation as it actually was, not as I'd been telling myself it was. That took something, not courage in any dramatic sense, just the ordinary willingness to stop looking away. Wisdom. Real wisdom isn't knowing a lot. It's being willing to examine the story you've been telling yourself and ask whether it's true. I'd been telling myself a story about being a devoted father, and that story was partially true, but it was also covering for something I didn't want to face. The day I sat down with that notepad and added everything up was the day I stopped telling the story and started seeing the facts. And the resilience required the energy of it. As my Vietnamese neighbor once described it to me, this quality of holding your shape under pressure that wasn't about being hard or cold. It was about staying clear when Lachlan sat at my kitchen table and looked genuinely hurt. It was about holding the line I'd drawn, not because I didn't love him, but precisely because I did, and because I finally understood that the most loving thing I could offer him now was the truth, clearly stated and consistently held. Kristen and Lachlan still have their lives. They're not destitute. They're capable adults who, for the first time in a long time, have to figure things out without a quiet transfer landing in their account when things get tight. That's not a tragedy. That's just life. The version most people live. And Zoe coming to see me on the bus, with her handmade card and her questions about the garden that afternoon, told me everything I needed to know about what actually matters. She didn't want anything from me except company. She asked if I was lonely. She said she was glad I was still here. That's what I planted those roses for. That's what I cooked that lamb for. All those years. Some things take a long time to find their way back to you. But if you hold your ground and stay honest and keep showing up for the people who deserve it, they do come back. The steak was good that night too. Ate the whole thing. Just me. In the garden. With the last of the good red. Maureen would have laughed at that, I think. She always said I didn't know how to cook for one. She was right, but I'm learning.